In 1649, royal inspectors in the mountain city of Potosi pulled coins out of circulation and found that a third of the silver was missing. The pieces of 8 stamped with the mark of Spain's own mint were not what they claimed to be. Merchants from Amsterdam to Manila began refusing them on sight. By then, the mines above the city had already broken the bodies of hundreds of thousands of forced laborers, and the Spanish crown that owned it all had gone bankrupt 6 separate times. All of it, the dead, the debt, the ruined coin, traced back to a soft grey-white metal too weak to hold an edge and too heavy to carry very far. You are almost certainly touching that same metal right now. A phone charger, a solar panel, maybe a ring on your own hand. Worth about $40 an ounce today. This is the story of how a metal that never once fed anyone financed 3 continents of empire and left the empire that mined it the poorest great power in Europe, a metal you are likely still carrying somewhere on you. It starts not in the Andes but in the hills of eastern Anatolia around 6,000 years ago. Silver does not occur often as a pure metal sitting in the open ground. It usually hides inside lead ore, bound up with the base metal the way a signal hides inside noise. Early metalworkers in the region that is now Turkey noticed something strange. Heat the lead hot enough, expose it to air, and the lead burns away as a crust while a bright, untouched pool of silver survives underneath. That process is called cupellation. Slag heaps in Anatolia and the Aegean carry evidence of it running as far back as the 4th millennium BCE. Archaeologists cannot say who first worked it out. What the slag shows is scale, whole hillsides of waste rock from furnaces that ran for generations. The first uses were not monetary at all. Silver went into beads, into temple vessels, into the small ornamental hoards that turn up in Bronze Age graves from Anatolia to Ur, worn as a display of who had access to fire hot enough to purify it. Silver's other early role was medicinal and ritual. Egyptian and Mesopotamian texts describe it as a purer, rarer cousin of gold, and in several Near Eastern languages the word for silver and the word for money became, eventually, the same word. That slippage is the clearest evidence historians have that silver became a unit of account long before anyone struck a coin from it. A metal's name folded into a word for money. That is not decoration. That is an economy forming. The technology that turned silver into portable, verifiable money arrived in the Kingdom of Lydia in western Anatolia in the 7th century BCE. Lydian metalworkers began stamping small lumps of electrum, a natural gold-silver alloy panned from local riverbeds, with an official mark guaranteeing weight and purity. Within a few generations, the mints of the Aegean had learned to separate gold from silver deliberately and strike each on its own. Silver coinage spread outward from there into Greece, where it financed the fleets, temples, and wars of the classical city-states. Athens had a particular advantage. The silver-bearing hills of Laurion, about 40 miles from the city, worked by an enslaved labor force historians estimate in the tens of thousands at the mine's peak in the 5th century BCE. The Athenians used that silver to build the 200 triremes that fought off the Persian invasion at Salamis in 480 BCE, a fleet purchased, in a very literal sense, with slave-mined metal. There is a persistent story that the Laurian strike of 483 BCE was a single lucky vein that saved Greece almost by accident. That version is a simplification. The mines had been worked for over a century before that, and what changed in 483 was a political decision, backed by the statesman Themistocles, to spend a windfall on ships instead of distributing it to citizens. The legend survives because the coincidence is real. The decision behind it was not luck. From there, silver became the working currency of the ancient and medieval Mediterranean, and separately of East Asia, where it would eventually become the backbone of Chinese taxation. But for 1,000 years after Rome, Europe's silver supply came almost entirely from a scatter of mines in Central Europe, the Harz Mountains, Saxony, and Bohemia. Small mines, deep, expensive to drain, and utterly unable to keep pace with a growing continent's appetite for coin. That scarcity is the condition the next 50 years of this story exist to solve. By the early 16th century, European silver output was already climbing as German engineers improved deep shaft drainage, roughly doubling Central European production between 1470 and 1520. It was not nearly enough. 3,000 miles across the Atlantic, an empire that did not yet know Europe existed was sitting on more silver than the entire continent had mined in its recorded history. Spain's road into that supply began with a hostage. In November 1532, a small Spanish force led by Francisco Pizarro seized the Inca emperor Atahualpa at Cajamarca in the Peruvian highlands. Atahualpa offered to buy his freedom. The ransom he promised became one of the largest metal payments ever assembled by one person. A room roughly 22 feet long, 17 feet wide, filled with gold to a line over 7 feet up the wall. 2 further rooms filled with silver. Runners spent months stripping temples and palaces across the empire to meet it. Spanish clerks who weighed the haul recorded 1,326,539 pesos of gold and 51,610 marks of silver, worth, converted forward, hundreds of millions of dollars today. Pizarro's men accepted the ransom. They kept Atahualpa imprisoned regardless, tried him on invented charges, and executed him by garrote in August 1533. The gold and silver did not buy his life. It bought Spain its first real look at how much precious metal a conquered empire could produce, and it set the pattern for everything that followed. Extract first, ask what it cost afterward. 12 years later, in 1545, that pattern found its true prize. An indigenous prospector working the Bolivian Altiplano, later Spanish accounts name him Diego Hualpa, is said to have chased a lost llama up a mountainside and lit a campfire that melted a trickle of silver out of the ground. That story was written down decades after the fact and carries the shape of a folk legend more than a documented event. What is documented is what happened next. Spanish officials moved in within months. The mountain he had stumbled onto was a reddish cone rising over 15,000 feet above sea level, one the Spanish named Cerro Rico, Rich Hill. It turned out to hold one of the largest concentrations of silver ore ever found on Earth. A second major strike followed in 1546 at Zacatecas in northern Mexico. Between them, these 2 sites would define the next century of world money. For the first 2 decades, Potosi's silver came out by smelting, small furnaces, wind-fired, that indigenous miners had used for generations, effective on rich surface ore, useless once the easy veins ran out. By the early 1550s, output was already sagging, and Spain had a supply problem on a continental scale. The break came from a Sevillian merchant named Bartolomé de Medina, who had spent years in Mexico experimenting with a way to pull silver out of low-grade ore using mercury instead of fire. Mercury bonds naturally with silver to form an amalgam. Heat it, and the mercury drives off, leaving pure metal behind. Metallurgists in Europe already understood the principle. Nobody had applied it at industrial scale to ore this poor. Medina refined a version using crushed ore mixed with mercury, salt, and copper sulfate, spread across open stone patios and trodden by mules to speed the chemical reaction. He patented it in 1554. He ran his first successful large-scale batch in Pachuca in 1555. The patio process, as it became known, could work ore too weak for any furnace, and it worked at a scale no smelter ever could. It reached Potosi in 1572, when Viceroy Francisco de Toledo brought mercury amalgamation south from Mexico and paired it with something Medina's original method never needed: an enormous, centrally organized, coerced workforce. Within 3 years, Potosi's output had roughly quadrupled. By the 1580s, the mountain and its sister mines in Mexico were producing so much silver that Spain's American colonies alone were minting more coin than the rest of the world combined. Here is the detail that mattered more than anyone in 1572 understood. The patio process needed roughly 1 part mercury for every 7 or 8 parts of silver recovered. Spain's entire silver economy now depended on a second metal, one that was rarer, more toxic, and controlled from a single mine 400 miles from Potosi. What Spain built on top of that discovery was not a free market. It was a state monopoly, run with the same instinct for control that any cartel would recognize. The crown claimed the quinto real, a 20% royal tax on every mark of silver mined in its American territories, collected before a single peso could legally leave the mine. All bullion had to pass through the Casa de Contratación in Seville, the royal trading house that licensed every ship, taxed every cargo, and prosecuted smuggling as a capital offence. From 1564 onward, silver crossed the Atlantic only in armed convoys, the treasure fleets, sailing on fixed schedules with warships as escort. A single galleon lost to piracy or storm could cost the crown a fortune it had usually already spent twice over. The crown's tightest chokehold, though, was mercury. Because the patio process could not run without it, Spain declared mercury a royal monopoly in 1559, controlled through two mines. Almaden in Spain and, after 1564, Huancavelica in Peru, a mercury deposit close enough to Potosi to supply it directly. Selling mercury outside crown channels carried the death penalty. Miners at Potosi could not simply buy amalgamation supplies on the open market. They bought mercury from the crown at a price the crown set. Spain effectively taxed silver twice, once on the way out as the quinto, once on the way in as the price of the one substance needed to extract it. Around the monopoly, an entire culture of restriction grew up. Silver export outside licensed channels was smuggling, punishable by confiscation and imprisonment. An illegal trade in unregistered black silver ran alongside the legal fleets for the whole colonial period anyway, invisible in the official ledgers and impossible to fully suppress. In Potosi itself, silver built one of the most stratified boom towns on earth. Spanish merchants and mine owners living in a city of churches and theatres that briefly rivaled London in population, while the indigenous workforce below them lived and often died on a rotating conscription system. The man who designed that system, Viceroy Toledo, held near absolute authority over the viceroyalty of Peru for 12 years and treated the mine's output as the single number that mattered above all others in his administration. He did not invent forced Andean labor. A rotational service obligation called the meter had existed under the Inca state before the Spanish arrived, but he formalized it, redirected it entirely towards silver, and expanded its reach until it touched 16 provinces across the highlands. What he built to feed one mountain would end up costing more lives than the conquest that opened the continent. By the late 1570s, the machine Toledo had assembled was running at a scale nobody fully controlled. Every year, 16 highland provinces were required to send roughly 1/7 of their adult male population to Potosi and Huancavelica on a rotating annual draft. Men pulled from their villages, marched for weeks with their families in tow, and set to work underground on a fixed quota that did not bend for illness, age, or accident. The system depended on a workforce nobody with power over it had to see. The men doing the dying were hundreds of miles from Lima, thousands of miles from Madrid. The decision-makers who benefited from the silver never set foot in the shafts. And it depended on one further weakness nobody wrote down in the official reports. The mercury itself was poison. At Huancavelica, ore was roasted to release mercury vapor, which miners breathed for shifts that could run 12 hours or more in tunnels with almost no ventilation. Contemporary observers already called it the mine of death. By the early 17th century, this was the structural fault line running under the entire operation. Two mines, one poisonous, one enormous, both worked by conscripted men with no legal power to refuse, feeding a state that measured success only in the weight of the shipment. Nobody positioned to stop it had a reason to. The toll began almost immediately and never really stopped for 2 centuries. In 1585, colonial officials were already recording petitions from meter villages describing men who never returned. By the 1600s, Spanish viceroys themselves, the same office that ran the system, were writing home with population numbers that alarmed even them. Viceroy Chinchon reported in 1633 that meter-obligated districts had lost 66% of their male population since the system began. Viceroy Alba de Liste reported in 1663 that some districts had lost 80%. A later viceroy, writing in the 1680s, still recorded losses above 40%. These are not estimates by outside historians reconstructing the past. They are numbers written by the men running the meter in their own official correspondence to Madrid, describing a workforce disappearing under their own administration. At Huancavelica, the mercury itself did the killing, slowly and specifically. Miners who survived their shifts developed tremors, loosened teeth, and blackened gums within months. Contemporary Spanish physicians documented the pattern clearly enough to have a name for it. Men who worked the mercury retorts rarely lasted past their 30s in the trade. At Potosi, the killers were more varied and just as steady. Rockfalls in unsupported tunnels, falls down shafts worked in near darkness by candlelight, exhaustion at an altitude above 13,000 feet, where the air itself carries roughly 40% less oxygen than at sea level, and a quota system that punished any worker who came up short. And it kept going. A modern regression analysis of Peru's 2011 electoral rolls, comparing surname diversity inside former meter districts against districts that were exempt, found population effects still visible 3.5 centuries after the system ended. Former meter districts show measurably fewer surnames. Entire family lines never recovered. The precise cumulative death count from 3 centuries of the meter is not something any single ledger recorded, and modern historians treat the figure sometimes repeated in popular accounts as high as 8 million as unverifiable, a number with no documented count behind it. What is documented, in the Viceroy's own reports, is depopulation in the 60 to 80% range across an entire region, sustained for generations. Even the low end of that range describes one of the deadliest peacetime labor systems in recorded history. The arithmetic behind it was never hidden. Viceroy Toledo's own writings describe the meter as the sinew of this kingdom, a phrase he used to justify a system he knew produced casualties, on the explicit grounds that Potosi's silver output could not be sustained without forced, cheap, and expendable labor. That was not a private admission. It was a governing philosophy, written into royal correspondence and defended in it. When the death toll at Huancavelica grew severe enough to threaten the mercury supply itself, the Crown's response was not to reform the conditions. It was, in the 1600s, to begin supplementing the workforce with enslaved Africans brought specifically to the more physically demanding roles at the Potosi Mint. A decision made because Andean labor mortality had already become a bottleneck. African captives represented, in the ledgers of the men making the decision, a replacement input rather than a policy failure to address. By 1611, Potosi's population had passed 150,000, briefly making it one of the largest cities anywhere on Earth, bigger at that moment than Madrid, Rome, or Paris. And through the whole of that boom, the underlying machine kept extracting the same fixed price. Bodies spent to hold a production quota in service of a metal that ended up leaving Spain almost as fast as it arrived. Because that is what happened to the silver, and it is the detail that makes Spain's story a paradox rather than simply a triumph. The Quinto Real and the treasure fleets shipped an estimated total of somewhere over 25,000 tons of silver across the Atlantic between the mid-16th and mid-18th centuries, a scale of bullion transfer the world had never seen. And almost none of it stayed. Spain's kings had borrowed so heavily and so far in advance of the fleet's arrival that shipments were frequently earmarked for foreign creditors before the ships had even left Veracruz or Portobello. Genoese banking houses supplied roughly 2/3 of the short-term loans, called asientos, that kept the Spanish war machine funded between treasure shipments. German banking families, the Fuggers and Welsers, held major concessions and mining rights in exchange for earlier loans to Charles V. The flood of metal did something else, too, something Spain's own economists began noticing within decades. Prices rose. European prices climbed roughly sixfold across the century and a half after the mid-1500s, an inflationary run historians call the price revolution. Spain, the country receiving the silver first, absorbed the sharpest early price increases of anywhere in Europe, since new money entering an economy raises prices before wages or trade patterns can adjust. Spanish manufacturers found their goods priced out of their own colonial markets by cheaper products from France and the Netherlands. Historians still debate how much of the price revolution's silver alone can explain. Population growth and rising demand for food played a real role too. But the timing, size, and geography of the price rise all point first toward the metal. Money that arrives before goods do just makes everything cost more. Spain's crown, meanwhile, was going broke in a way that startled its own creditors, given how much metal was crossing the Atlantic in its name. Philip II suspended payments on crown debt in 1557, within a year of inheriting the throne, an act that wiped out the Fugger banking dynasty's Spanish exposure and forced a renegotiation. He suspended again in 1560 and again in 1575 in a default covering debt worth close to twice the crown's annual revenue. The Genoese consortium holding most of it only agreed to new terms after accepting write-downs as steep as 50% on some loans. A fourth suspension followed in 1596, near the end of his reign. His successors kept the pattern running. A further suspension in 1607, another in 1627, and a sixth in 1647. 6 sovereign defaults in 90 years. By the country receiving the largest transfer of precious metal in recorded history up to that point. Spain was not poor because it lacked silver. Spain was poor because it had turned a stream of the world's most valuable metal into collateral for a permanent war, spent years before it arrived, and taxed at every step by bankers who never touched a shovel. By the 1640s, the strain had become structural. Spain fought the Dutch, the French, and its own rebelling territories almost continuously. In 1640, 2 of its own possessions, Portugal and Catalonia, rose in revolt in the same year. Historians link that crisis directly to a crown squeezing every remaining resource, silver included, to fund wars it could no longer otherwise afford. Inside Spain, the government began debasing its own domestic copper coinage called vellon, repeatedly through the early 17th century, issuing coins with less metal than their face value claimed. The result was waves of internal inflation. It hit ordinary Spaniards, who never saw a single peso of American silver, hardest of all. And at Potosi itself, the fraud discovered in 1649, corrupt mint officials striking coin with debased silver content and pocketing the difference, was severe enough that Spanish pieces of 8 were briefly refused in ports as far away as the Dutch trading posts of Southeast Asia. It took the crown roughly a decade to rebuild confidence in its own currency, a kingdom that mined more silver than any state in history had. By the mid-17th century, wrecked the credibility of the coin stamped with its own king's face. What finally broke the old order was not any single blow, but the slow exhaustion of the system's core resource. Cerro Rico's richest surface ore was largely worked out by the 1630s, and output at Potosi fell by more than half between its peak in the 1610s and the end of the century, even as mercury poisoning kept thinning the workforce that remained. Silver production shifted north, toward Mexico's mines at Zacatecas and later Guanajuato, which by the 18th century were outproducing Peru. And a separate current of the same metal had already been running the other direction for a century, across the Pacific rather than the Atlantic. Beginning in 1565, Spanish galleons sailing between Acapulco and Manila carried American silver directly into the hands of Chinese merchants who wanted it more than any market on earth. China's Ming government had, from 1581 onward, converted its tax system to run almost entirely on silver payments under a reform called the Single Whip Law, and Chinese domestic silver mines could not begin to meet the demand that created. The exchange rate made the trade nearly irresistible. Silver bought roughly twice as much gold in China as it did in Europe for most of the 16th century. A Spanish trader could buy Chinese silk and porcelain with silver, sell them in Mexico or Spain, and effectively pocket the currency conversion gap as pure profit on top of the goods themselves. Over the roughly 2.5 centuries the Manila galleon route ran, best estimates put somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of all the silver mined in Spanish America crossing the Pacific into China instead. Not the Atlantic. Not Spain. A second empire's economy quietly running on the same mountain. And that is the detail that looked small at the time and was not. The silver Spain fought hardest to control never stayed inside a Spanish economy at all. It became China's money supply. It became Genoa's collateral. It became Amsterdam's trading capital. By the time anyone in Madrid added up what was left, the answer was very little. By the early 1700s, Spain's global silver dominance was effectively finished. Bolivia's mines had passed their peak. English, Dutch, and French competitors had built rival trading networks that no longer needed Spanish convoys at all, and new mineral wealth increasingly flowed through non-Spanish hands. Spain, the nation whose colonies had produced most of the world's silver for 2 centuries, entered the 18th century as one of Europe's weaker powers. Its treasury still routinely short, its navy in decline, its once feared Atlantic fleet reduced to a fraction of its former size. The Habsburg dynasty that had presided over the entire silver boom died out in Spain in 1700, its bloodline exhausted by generations of inbreeding among a royal family with, on paper, one of the richest incomes on the planet. The irony sits at the center of the whole story. The people who fought hardest to control Potosi's silver, the Spanish crown, the viceroys, the mint officials, ended up among the least enriched by it. The people who touched none of the mining and bore none of the risk, the Genoese lenders, the Dutch and English merchants working the arbitrage, the Chinese state absorbing it as tax revenue, captured most of the lasting value. Spain kept the mine, everyone else kept the money. Today, Cerro Rico is still being mined. The mountain that once produced perhaps half the world's silver in a single stretch of the 16th and 17th centuries is now hollowed out, with an estimated 15,000 kilometers of tunnels, so extensively excavated that engineers warn the peak has already sunk roughly 250 meters and could partially collapse within years. Somewhere between 10 and 30,000 miners, organized into cooperatives rather than a colonial draft, still work inside it. In 2025 alone, at least 90 of them died in accidents inside the mountain. A number local journalists say almost certainly undercounts the real total. Silver itself has become one of the most demanded industrial metals on Earth, not despite its history as money, but because of properties that were always there and simply were not the point until now. It conducts electricity and heat better than any other metal. That makes it essential in electronics, in the solar panels multiplying across the world's rooftops, and increasingly in electric vehicles, which use significantly more silver per unit than gasoline cars. Global mine production reached roughly 26,000 tons in 2025, led by Mexico, Peru, and China. Bolivia, once the center of the entire silver universe, now produces a small fraction of what it did at the height of the meter. Industrial demand alone hit a record 680 million ounces in 2024, with solar panels accounting for close to 30% of that figure, up from just 11% a decade earlier. And the market has run in deficit, more silver consumed than mined, for 5 straight years, a shortfall that helped push prices to roughly $38 an ounce on average across 2025, with a brief spike above $53 in November. Nobody has fully replaced the meter's brutality with anything resembling safety. Bolivia's cooperative miners at Cerro Rico work with minimal safety equipment. They breathe silica dust that causes silicosis within a decade or two of exposure. According to the miners who work there, few expect to see old age in the trade. The mine that helped finance a global empire has never stopped taking a toll on the people inside it. It has simply stopped making the country above it rich. And that, in the end, is the whole shape of the story, folded down to one sentence. Silver bought empires and then bankrupted the one that mined it. Silver funded a century of Spanish wars and then left the treasury that spent it with nothing to show but debt. Silver built the tallest, richest city in the Americas and then buried tens of thousands of the people who built it. Silver crossed 2 oceans and financed everyone's ambitions except the country that controlled the mine. You already carry a trace of that same metal in a phone, a laptop, maybe a ring in a drawer. Worth today what silver has always been worth, not the object itself, but whoever controls where it comes from and who gets paid first when it moves. If any part of this surprised you, the 8 million disputed, the 6 bankruptcies, the mountains still collapsing under your feet in real time as you watch this, tell which one in the comments. And if this is the history you want more of, subscribe, because Mint Law has a lot more of it.